60,000 American soldiers were locked in gas chambers by their own military and then ordered never to speak of it again. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States Chemical Warfare Service conducted one of the largest secret human experimentation programs in modern military history, exposing tens of thousands of enlisted men to mustard gas and lewisite at more than a dozen installations across the country and beyond. The men were told they were testing protective equipment. They were told they were serving their country. What they were not told was that they were the experiment, and what no one knew at the time, what wouldn't surface for nearly 5 decades, would change everything we thought we understood about how the American government treated its own soldiers. After Pearl Harbor, the fear of chemical warfare became an institutional obsession. The Axis powers had stockpiled chemical agents, and the United States military believed a gas attack on Allied forces was not a question of if, but when. The Chemical Warfare Service, operating out of Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland and a network of testing sites from Oklahoma to Panama, began an aggressive campaign to recruit human subjects. They pulled soldiers from basic training, from infantry units, from engineering battalions. They told them the work was classified and essential. They told them almost nothing else. Inside the sealed chambers at Edgewood Arsenal, men stood shoulder to shoulder while mustard gas hissed through vents in the walls. Some wore gas masks, some wore partial protective clothing, and some, by deliberate design, wore nothing at all. The Chemical Warfare Service was not merely testing whether equipment worked. It was testing how much poison a human body could absorb before it broke down. These were the so-called man-break tests, clinical trials engineered to find the precise threshold at which a chemical agent would incapacitate a soldier. The language was sterile, the reality was not. Liquid mustard agent was applied directly to bare skin. Men were sealed inside chambers for hours while blistering agents saturated the air around them. When they emerged, many were covered in chemical burns that wept and scarred. The soldiers had no framework for what was happening to them. They had volunteered, or believed they had, to help develop better gas masks, better uniforms, better defenses for the men fighting overseas. They were not told the true purpose of the tests. They were not told the chemicals could cause cancer. They were not given the choice to refuse. The experiments carried an additional dimension that transformed them from reckless to calculated. The Chemical Warfare Service didn't just test chemical agents on soldiers, it sorted them by race first. Military researchers designed comparative studies that grouped subjects into categories: white, colored, Puerto Rican, and Japanese. The operating hypothesis was rooted in racial pseudoscience, the belief that darker skin might offer greater or lesser resistance to chemical burns, that different ethnic groups might metabolize poison differently. The protocol was explicit. It appeared in internal documents. It was not an accident of wartime bureaucracy, but a deliberate architecture of racial experimentation layered on top of an already unconscionable program. Black and Puerto Rican soldiers were disproportionately selected for the most dangerous exposure tests. Japanese American troops, many of whom had families confined to internment camps while they served, were subjected to targeted experiments that treated their bodies as proxies for the enemy. The logic was as simple as it was grotesque. If the U.S. intended to use chemical weapons in the Pacific, it needed to know how those weapons would affect Japanese skin. And so it tested on Japanese Americans and called it defense research. The consequences of what happened next in these programs would prove devastating, not just in the moment, but across entire lifetimes. But first, the program needed to expand beyond the laboratory. On San Jose Island off the coast of Panama, the experiments left the chamber and entered the field. Soldiers were marched through dense tropical jungle while mustard gas hung in the humid air around them. The conditions were designed to simulate chemical combat in the Pacific theater: the wet heat, the thick vegetation, the impossibility of escape. Unlike the controlled environment of Edgewood Arsenal, the jungle trials offered no walls, no ventilation, no pretense of clinical distance. Men walked through contaminated terrain for hours. The agent clung to their uniforms, their skin, the vegetation they brushed against. Many suffered severe chemical burns across large portions of their bodies. Some collapsed on the trails. The isolation of San Jose Island served a second purpose. There were no outside observers, no civilian oversight, no journalists, no families, no congressional aides asking questions. What happened in the jungle stayed in the jungle, by design. The Chemical Warfare Service operated in the gap between military authority and public accountability, and in that gap, it found the freedom to push its experiments far beyond what any informed consent process would have permitted. As the war drew to a close, the military moved to seal the program from history. Every test subject was ordered to never discuss the experiments. The threat was not abstract. Soldiers were told that disclosure would result in court-martial or prosecution under the Espionage Act, the same statute used to prosecute spies. For young enlisted men, many of them barely out of their teens, the message was unambiguous. What happened to you is a secret, and if you tell anyone, you will go to prison. The Pentagon classified all records related to the chemical testing program. Medical files disappeared into restricted archives. The institutional knowledge of what had been done to 60,000 men was compressed into classified folders and locked away. And so began a silence that would last nearly half a century. Veterans went home carrying chemical burns and chronic coughs and questions no one would answer. They carried the weight of what had been done to them alongside the explicit instruction that they could never speak of it. Many never did, not to their wives, not to their doctors, not to anyone. And then came the moment that would define everything that followed, not a revelation, but the slow accumulation of consequences in bodies that had been quietly breaking down for decades. The men who walked out of those gas chambers came home to a country that would spend the next 50 years pretending they didn't exist. Veterans began developing chronic health conditions in the years and decades following exposure. Skin cancers that appeared on the exact patches of skin where mustard agent had been applied, respiratory diseases that eroded their lungs year after year, eye damage that stole their vision. When they filed claims with the Department of Veterans Affairs, they were denied. The reason was circular and absolute. The experiments were classified, which meant they officially did not exist, which meant no disability could be attributed to them. The government had created a closed loop, classify the evidence, then use the absence of evidence to deny the harm. No medical follow-up was ever provided to any test subject. No physician was dispatched to check on the men. No letter was sent. The Chemical Warfare Service had used their bodies and then abandoned them to whatever consequences followed. For Rollins Edwards, a Black Army veteran who had endured chemical exposure at Edgewood Arsenal, the decades that followed were defined by recurring skin lesions that never fully healed. He applied to the VA repeatedly. He was denied repeatedly. His story was not unique. It was the default experience of virtually every veteran who tried to seek help. In 1991, Congress finally commissioned the Institute of Medicine to investigate what the military had spent 5 decades denying. The investigation, directed by Constance M. Pechura, culminated in the 1993 report titled Veterans at Risk: The Health Effects of Mustard Gas and Lewisite. The findings confirmed what veterans had been saying for years. The experiments were real, the exposure was deliberate, and the health consequences were severe and lasting. The report recommended that the VA identify all surviving test subjects and review their disability claims with the understanding that their conditions were service-connected. Senator J. Rockefeller of West Virginia chaired Senate hearings in 1994 that brought the program into the congressional record. For the first time, veterans testified publicly about what had been done to them. For the first time, the secrecy order that had silenced them for decades was formally acknowledged as a tool of institutional concealment rather than national security. The hearings exposed a system that had not merely failed these men, but had been designed to ensure their silence and their suffering. The VA began reviewing claims, but the scale of the task revealed the depth of the original cover-up. The VA managed to locate fewer than 4,000 of the estimated 60,000 test subjects. The rest had died, disappeared into the gaps of an indifferent bureaucracy, or simply never learned that the government had finally acknowledged what had been done to them. For those who were found, the claims process moved with excruciating slowness. Decades-old medical records had to be reconstructed. Classification barriers had to be navigated. Veterans in their 70s and 80s were asked to prove exposures that the government itself had hidden for half a century. Many died before their claims were resolved. In 2015, NPR investigative journalist Caitlin Dickerson published a comprehensive investigation that brought the story to a national audience. She found Rollins Edwards, then in his 90s, still bearing the scars of mustard gas exposure on his arms, still waiting for full recognition from the government that had used him as a test subject 7 decades earlier. Researcher Susan Matsumoto had spent years advocating for Japanese-American veterans whose contributions and suffering had been doubly erased, first by the experiments, then by the internment of their families. Dickerson's reporting made visible what the classification system had been designed to hide, that real men with real names had been poisoned by their own government and then abandoned. There is no clean ending to this story, because for most of the men involved, there was no ending at all, only a silence imposed by power and maintained by indifference. The chemical burns faded into scars. The scars faded into medical records. The medical records faded into classified archives, and 60,000 American soldiers became a footnote that their own country spent half a century trying not to read.